Welcome to the Canon Connected, where we read the connections, see the connections, and study the connections of the Bible. We are so glad to have you here on day number 29 of the Canon Connected, and today we're continuing a series through the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And yesterday, just as we did with Noah and we did with Abraham, we actually had a day where the entire story, so to speak, maybe not all the details, but the story in general is read in one sitting, and that we aim for that quite often in this reading plan, despite it being about connected passages. And so yesterday was the entirety of the Sodom and Gomorrah story from Genesis 10 to 19. And today we're going to talk about some commentary in the rest of the Bible, and several. If you did the readings today, you can see it. This idea that God refers back to Sodom and Gomorrah frequently throughout the Old and New Testament is quite obvious. And the reasons, I think, are that because the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah were so significant. And not that, in one sense, every sin will send you to hell. I understand that. But there are definitely some things that are classified as abominations. Again, meaning God hates them in the Bible. And Sodom and Gomorrah was guilty of two things that we're going to talk about that were so sinful that I think he frequently refers back to this event. The event where, again, God destroyed this city with fire from heaven, so much so that you can see the smoke rising up from the town, whenever you looked at it. And one of the cleverest sermon titles I've ever heard in my life was from a pastor who preached on Sodom and Gomorrah, and he called it Unholy Smoke. But God refers back to this story, Genesis 18 and 19, frequently, and we see that today. So the first connection I really want you to see is just that when you read Isaiah 1, and whenever you read, several passages in Jeremiah, 3 of them today, a fourth from Jeremiah and Lamentations, and then you see it in Ezekiel, you see it in Amos, you see it in Zephaniah, and then in 3 different passages in the New Testament at least. I think it's possible I missed some. My ignorance of the Bible is definitely on display as I go through it. But you can see that God recalls this judgment, and he uses it to remind his people and other nations. We see not just Israel being judged and compared to Sodom and Gomorrah, but we see, Babylon, we see Edom, we see the Moabites and the Ammonites, all compared to Sodom and Gomorrah as far as God's judgment. So when God judges people in the Bible, this is probably his number one way of illustrating it. And not only that, but we see in the New Testament that it's even the future judgment of all people who are unsaved, not followers of Jesus, is compared to Sodom and Gomorrah as well. So this event obviously is very significant. God wants us to know the story of Sodom and Gomorrah so that all of these passages that we read today, all scattered throughout the Bible, can make sense. But it really, truly only makes sense because in some passages he just refers to Sodom and Gomorrah and doesn't mention the sin, but in many of them he does, and it helps us to get an idea for what it was that those people did that was so wicked. And we don't need to be out of balance on this because the two things I'm going to talk about, because they come straight from the text, these texts that we read today, these connected passages, are the sin of not caring about the poor and needy, and then the sin of sexual perversion. And again, we don't need to be out of balance there. The Bible is not. The Bible speaks to both of these in several of the passages that we read today. So starting in Isaiah 1, this is again the first place that I could find with this first sin that I'm going to talk about, not caring about the poor and needy, not caring about victims, about injustice. There may be a passage before this, I don't know. But in Isaiah 1, he again refers to Sodom and Gomorrah. He says, if the Lord of hosts had not left us a few survivors, we should have been like Sodom and become like Gomorrah. And then God even says, hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom. Give ear to the teaching of our God, you people of Gomorrah. So God's, again, using the illustration, a simile, of saying these people are Sodom and Gomorrah, although not literally. Their sins are the same. Then he goes into talking about how God says he does not want the worship of his people because they're like Sodom and Gomorrah. And he talks about how hypocritical it is. He says some harsh things here. Bring me no more vain offerings. This would be like saying, don't come to the worship service on Sunday morning and sing to me, okay? Don't come and bring your tithes and offerings. Don't come and listen to the preaching. Your incense is abomination to me, new moon and Sabbath and the calling of convocations. I cannot endure iniquity and solemn assembly. Your new moons and your appointed feast my soul hates. Wow. They have become a burden to me, God talking. I am weary of bearing them. When you spread out your hands, I will hide my eyes from you. Even though you make many prayers, I will not listen. And why is he so upset at them? Why is God talking in such extreme judgment language? Well, the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah are the same here. And there are other things other than this. He mentions things like lying, drunkenness. He mentions their hands are full of blood, meaning murder. But then he also says, verse 16, wash yourselves, make yourselves clean. Remove the evil of your deeds from before my eyes. Cease to do evil. Learn to do good. Seek justice. Correct oppression. Bring justice to the fatherless. Plead the widow's cause. So you can't miss it in the Bible, and you can't miss it as a connection to Sodom and Gomorrah. Even if that one isn't convincing, the one from Ezekiel makes it clear that we're supposed to connect Sodom and Gomorrah to not caring about the poor and needy. And so I think it's extremely important that Christians care about this, and truly not even in a sense of providing financial help for victims, especially widows, orphans, or really anybody who is a victim of injustice. And again, I don't think you have to go very far. You don't have to go to the slums of cities to find people. There's probably people who are in great need of all sorts of help, especially relational help, within 20 minutes of most of the people listening to this podcast right now. And I don't even think it's financial help or visiting widows or gathering supplies for foster kids or whatever. I think it's also the way the Bible talks about this, including right here, it's also an issue of whenever you have problems in systems, legal government systems, and we would be foolish to think it can't happen in a country like the United States. Probably it's less common in many cultures all over the world, definitely throughout human history, but it happens. And so I think Christians should care about lawyers and judges and should be lawyers and judges and legislatures because we should care about people who are victims of injustice. We should care about those things. And this is sin connected to Sodom and Gomorrah. And if you think, again, that's not a strong comparison, I will be glad to read to you that God, again, in Ezekiel 16, says the same thing. He says, and your elder sister Samaria, who lived with her daughters to the north of you, and your younger sister, who lived in the south of you, is Sodom with her daughters. Not only did you walk in their ways and do according to their abominations, but listen, he's talking to his own people here, not literally Sodom and Gomorrah. He says, not only did you walk in their ways and according to their abominations, within a very little time you were more corrupt than they in all your ways. Think about how wicked we think in our minds today, even in modern Christianity, how bad Sodom and Gomorrah is. And God says his own people were worse than them. So what were they doing that was so bad? Behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. They were haughty and did an abomination before me. So, one translation says they were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They didn't care about the cause of the poor and needy. Think people like that live in our midst today? Are we people like that? Am I a person like that? I think absolutely yes. And it's easy to compare myself to other people and then try to keep track of my good works, and good deeds. But I tell you, when I compare myself to the Bible, I come up way short. In an average day, the amount of time I spend is arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned, even literally overfed. I've talked about this already with praying and fasting. Whenever I'm not fasting, the amount of food that I eat and how frequently I eat is a testimony to the fact that, again, it makes it easy for me not to care about people who don't have, because my life is easy. And it's easy for us to be arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned, just as these people were. And in a sense, they were worse than Sodom and Gomorrah. But these were the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah. I also included Ezekiel 22. It's talking about the same thing. The people of the land have practiced extortion and committed robbery. They have oppressed the poor and needy, the orphan, widow, and he also even says they have extorted from the sojourner, the immigrant, without justice. And he doesn't mention Sodom and Gomorrah in this passage, but he says, therefore I have poured out my indignation upon them. I have consumed them with the fire of my wrath, which recalls Sodom and Gomorrah to me. So I think it should be included. And in the same way, there is a second very obvious sin from the story that you read yesterday that gets brought up frequently whenever Sodom and Gomorrah is talked about in the other parts of the Bible in connected passages. And it's the sin of sexual perversion, committing sexual acts outside of what God's intentional or original and intentional plan was in Genesis chapter 2. So it says again in Genesis 23, comparing them to Sodom and Gomorrah, he says, but in the prophets of Jerusalem I have seen a horrible thing. They commit adultery and walk in lies. They strengthen the hands of evildoers so that no one turns from evil. All of them have become like Sodom to me, and its inhabitants like Gomorrah. And adultery is the first sin committed. And then, or mentioned. And then we go to 2 Peter It's the same thing. And by the way, it talks about how I mentioned yesterday that just like Noah, Lot was rescued, despite the fact everybody around him was wicked. And I think about the one that comes to the top of my brain is always like a nation like North Korea today, which might be 0.01% Christian or whatever, and how God will save those people. That's part of this passage as well, and recalling Sodom and Gomorrah. But he also, again, details the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah, Peter does, in talking about false prophets, whenever he says, if by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, verse 6, to ashes, he condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly. And what is the ungodly? What are they like? Well, if he rescued Lot, greatly distressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked, and that word almost assuredly means, sensual conduct means having free reign to have any sort of sexual behavior that you want. It could possibly mean other things too, but I think that's the heart of that word. Just anything goes. Just absolutely, everybody does what is right in their own eyes sexually. Just absolutely no parameters, no rules, no doctrine from God on how it should be. And that's what Sodom and Gomorrah was guilty of. We can see it in the story. As far as that righteous man lived among them day after day, he was tormented in his righteous soul over their lawless deeds that he saw and heard. And he says in verse 10, especially those who indulge in the lust of defiling passion and despise authority. Now, the lust of defiling passion can mean anything that your flesh wants that's ungodly, not just anything sexual. But I think that's included. And then Jude, of course, says it as well, whenever it says, verse 7, just as Sodom and Gomorrah and its surrounding cities, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire, literally strange flesh. And the idea, I think, again, is things that are perverted, things that are not what God intended, not what God designed, things that lie outside of that. It's strange because it's not ordinary within God's law. And it's connected to sexual morality. That's exactly what, we see in the story. So both of those things are a huge deal sin-wise to God, and both of those things are what Sodom and Gomorrah was guilty of, and what God's people and other nations that he extended judgment to throughout the Bible were also guilty of. And it's what we are guilty of today as well. We don't need to pretend these things aren't prevalent even in churches today. And so we need to really do self-evaluation on these things. Are we arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned? Are we practicing, the sexual ethics the way that the Bible teaches? And it doesn't even have to be just, again, the physical act. Jesus put, lust on the same plane with the physical acts. Any man looks at a woman and lusts after her, he has committed adultery in his heart. That's Matthew 5:28. And on that note, we will revisit the actual story of Sodom and Gomorrah later on this year. We're going to do 10 Commandments and do every single one of them and how their different passages connect around those 10 verses. And we're going to do 4 days of adultery and all these passages that have to do with sexual morality. And we'll go back to Sodom and Gomorrah, not just for any old reason, but because Judges 19 and Genesis 19 are very deeply connected on this topic. So tomorrow we're not going to really turn the page. We won't talk about Sodom and Gomorrah specifically, but we're going to do 4 days on this topic as well. There are hundreds of verses in the Bible that talk about how God will judge with fire. We saw that in a few passages today, but we're going to talk about it with the passages that don't mention Sodom and Gomorrah by name, but say, even again, and historically in the Bible and in the future, the imagery of fire is very common when it comes to God's judgment. And so we're going to see that over the span of the next 4 days. So we hope you'll come back and be with us as we continue to read the connections, see the connections, and study the connections. Thank you.